Welcome to the German Council on Foreign Relations, DGAP, and welcome to today's morning briefing. My name is Jan Stöckmann, and I'm head of the Karl Kaiser Forum, which is a new initiative here at DGAP for strategic questions to be launched later this year. In today's morning briefing, we are looking at the NATO Summit scheduled for the 24th to the 25th of June in The Hague next week. The summit is promising to be a crucial test for the alliance, which is facing both external and internal challenges in a world of revisionism, power politics, and violence, a world that has departed from the rules and institutions built over the course of the 20th century. Now, this summit will be about current events, of course, but also about the transatlantic alliance itself, about burden sharing, about the European pillar in NATO, and about the role of the US under President Donald Trump. It looks like NATO members might agree on some form of a 5% spending target, but in a policy brief published by DGAP's European Zeitenwende Strategy Group, funded by Mercator Stiftung, the authors argue that discussions should focus on the developments of key capabilities, such as air defense systems, intelligence, and surveillance capabilities, rather than on the volume of defense spending itself. It will be the first summit led by Mark Rutte as Secretary General, who, by the way, in his previous role, led a country whose defense spending was consistently below 1.5% of GDP in the last 2 decades. Besides the state dinner on the 24th of June and the North Atlantic Council on the 25th, there will be ample room for discussion on the margins of the conference, including the Defense Industry Forum and also the NATO Public Forum, which I believe Aylin Matlé will be attending. Now, will The Hague achieve what is needed to strengthen the alliance? Can member states agree on specific targets? And perhaps more importantly, is the power of common military deterrence intact? What's Europe's and what's Germany's role? To discuss these questions, I'm delighted to introduce today's panel. First up will be Dr. Aylin Matlé, who's a senior research fellow in the Center for Security and Defense here at DGAP. She was previously deputy head of the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung office in Jerusalem. Her research focuses on security and defense policy, and she has written a PhD on defense policy of European NATO members and US engagement on NATO during the Obama administration. She also has a recent piece out with our colleague Andras Raj called How to Deter Russia from Attacking the Baltics, which my colleagues will be happy to share in the chat. Welcome, Aylin. Next will be General Stefan Schulz, who is a major general in the German army. He is the deputy head of the political department at the Federal Ministry of Defense. Previously, he has served in senior positions inter alia as a German military representative to NATO and to the EU. He has served at the Federal Chancellery in the past and at the Federal Ministry of Defense. Welcome. Good morning, General Schulz. Finally, last but not least, Dr. Robin Allers is Associate Professor at the Norwegian Institute for Defense Studies and the Norwegian Defense University College, where he researches and teaches on European security. He's also the Program Director for the Master in Military Studies, which is Norway's highest military education. Since April this year, he's one of 6 editors of the magazine Sirius, the Zeitschrift für strategische Analysen, and I should mention he's a member of the aforementioned DGAP European Zeitenwende Strategy Group. Now, before we begin, just a few housekeeping announcements. As per usual, we would like to remind everyone that this event is being recorded and will be uploaded subsequently. We'll kick off our conversation here on the panel with about 5 minutes of introduction remarks each, and then open up for questions after about 30 minutes. If you'd like to ask a question or make a comment, please raise your hand, briefly introduce yourself, and keep your question or comment relatively short so we can pick up as many as possible. Finally, just a word of thanks to all my colleagues supporting the DGAP morning briefing series, Milan Nitsch, Helga Beck, Lili Tran, Patrick Teichmann, and also Mario Baumann in the Zeitenwende Strategy Group. Now, without much further ado, over to you, Aylin. If you could help us to make sense of the state of the alliance since the last summit, and especially since the Trump presidency. Where are we now, and what are your expectations for the summit?
Good morning, and thanks for the invitation and the opportunity to share some observations and thoughts with you this morning. I will do that in 3 brief steps. Firstly, as Jan already alluded to, the state of NATO since the last summit, especially since Trump was re-elected last November. And then I will also give a very brief outlook on the expectations for the summit. starting with the state of NATO since the last summit. On the operational level, we can assess that the regional plans covering the entirety of NATO territory have already been approved 2 years ago at the Vilnius summit. And ever since, the implementation of these plans has been assessed and is still ongoing. While progress in that regard can be noted, there's still room for improvement in terms of implementation, and I'm sure that that objective and that topic will be discussed later on this month, namely next week in The Hague. Moving on to the defense planning level, which the NDPP, NATO's defense planning process, is sort of the heart. The NDPP is at a stage of assigning capability targets to each individual ally now. That already has occurred earlier this month. And the assignment of capability targets is based on so-called minimum capability requirements, which in turn has been informed by a threat analysis, which occurred for the very first time since the end of the Cold War. Now, on the political strategic level, clearly and unsurprisingly, the re-election and prior to that, the prospect of a possible return of Donald Trump to the White House has dominated the political agenda of NATO by and large. And that brings me to my second point, what has changed since Trump's re-election. While Trump's campaign and presidential campaign has been deeply rooted in skepticism of NATO, rehashing some of his accusations towards the alliance, dating back to his first term, including the reproach of Europeans not spending enough on defense, and also earlier, earlier in his before he started actually campaigning, literally inviting Putin to do with so-called delinquent allies, whatever, and I'm quoting, the hell he wants to do with those allies. Trump's administration and Trump's administration's approach towards the alliance has been relatively tame since his inauguration compared to what could have happened and what some expected to happen. Now, I just want to flag some indicators I base this assessment on. Firstly, thus far, there are no decisions of withdrawal plans that have been announced in terms of US troops being withdrawn or redeployed from Europe to other theaters or back to the United States. The US NATO ambassador has been appointed relatively quickly after Trump's inauguration. Then we also have now again, American succor, which also was in doubt and in question earlier this year, because there were rumors that the Americans would want to shift this position to the Europeans, which would have indicated a lesser commitment of Americans towards the alliance. And then, unlike in the beginning of his second term, the US is now also applying the logic of spending 5% on defense to itself as well, not only to European and Canadian allies respectively. And then finally, Defense Minister Hegseth has praised some European allies, including Germany, as quote-unquote model allies in terms of their defense planning and defense spending goals. And I should also mention that at least at the moment, we're not hearing any talk coming from DC, from the administration, that the US is not wanting to commit itself to Article 5 any longer. None of these indicators are signaling a more, these indicators are signaling a more constructive role of the US in the alliance. And obviously none of those are written in stone. At the same time, they, in my mind, give reason for hope that Trump doesn't necessarily want to be a disruptor in chief vis-a-vis NATO. And that brings me to my last point, expectations and hopes for the summit. And I think it really depends on who you ask when raising that question and that topic. I would say the hopes of Europeans and Canadians, as well as NATO itself as an organization, are firstly, sort of the primary objective is that the event, i.e. the summit, is to go down as smoothly as possible without any unpleasant surprises in light of Trump's behavior that is oftentimes erratic and unpredictable. Another key objective is, and hope, is to keep the US on board with regards to a continued commitment to Article 5, as well as a continuation to describe Russia as the most severe and acute threat not only to Europe, but the entire Euro-Atlantic theater, which also includes the US. And then finally, I would assume that at least some Europeans, or most Europeans probably, are hoping to squeeze in at least some reference to Ukraine, which will in all likelihood, due to US objections, not dominate the agenda of NATO summits as it did in recent years since 2022. And then finally, expectations. The US and also some European allies clearly expect, and I think that is sort of almost a done deal, the approval of the so-called 5% goal, which obviously means that 3.5% of GDP are supposed to go towards military spending and 1.5% towards infrastructure spending, supporting military objectives. I think a sort of, in addition to that, a clear commitment in concrete to lay out a concrete timeline instead of being watered down in a vague language is also an expectation coming especially from DC. And I think I've already run out of time, which is why I will stop at this point. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Aylin. Matlé, we'll come back to you with questions briefly, but let's move on to Stefan Schulz, General. If you could comment on the German perspective on the upcoming summit, the transatlantic burden sharing, and perhaps the German defense budget itself a little bit. Over to you.
Yes, thank you very much. And thank you very much for being invited to this distinguished group. Good morning to everyone. A couple of points on the summit. The summit is close, but as you might know, negotiations and deliberations on the summit, especially with respect to a communiqué or a leader statement, normally go on until the last moment. And that's where we are at the moment. Negotiations are running. The program is being finalized to that, but nothing is set in stone right yet. The preparations are very intense at that stage. As we envisaged NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte, the summit will be a lean summit. There will be only one session of the North Atlantic Council at the level of heads of state and governments. And there will be a very concise leader statement, not one of these communiques, which we quite often have with many, many pages. So it will be likely one paper coming out, very concise and crisp. From all we know, President Trump intends to participate in the summit. This by itself can be considered a success, which we can owe to NATO Secretary Rutte's forward-looking preparation and negotiations. From our perspective, it's paramount to send a message of unity and strength at the summit. That is the key message. To that end, all allies, including the United States, must assert their strong and unequivocal commitment to collective defense, to Article 5. Through such a signal, the allied resolve and unity would be demonstrated, and the summit in The Hague would be a success. And if I could react to Aylin, also we have no signals that the US wants to reduce their commitment to NATO, and that is particularly true with respect to the extended nuclear deterrence, which is very important for us Europeans, non-nuclear nations. That's the key message. The key deliverable of the summit will be the significant increase in defense spending. That is a point the US administration consistently reiterated President Trump's call for an annual 5% GDP. Aylin already mentioned about the negotiations. The new defense spending pledge will have two components. One is the 3.5% defense spending that is on core defense requirements in accordance to the long-standing definitions we had at NATO. But in addition, there will be this other element, this 1.5%, and that would include a number of elements. For example, investments to enable the execution of NATO's and national defense plans. It would include investments to enhance resilience and civil preparedness. It would encompass investments to promote defense industrial capacity and counter hybrid actions. Also, the support to NATO partners in their defense and security sector will be an element to that. That would mean those expenditures Germany has related to our Enable and Enhance initiative, Ertüchtigungsinitiative, would fall under this category. As we all know, the discussion currently, especially in the media, concentrates very much on the percentage. That has a lot of attraction, but we in the Ministry of Defense, for us, it's important to stress that our key focus is on implementing the capability targets and improving the warfighting readiness of the armed forces of the Bundeswehr. A quick word on the capability targets. The target packages that the NATO defense ministers agreed at their meeting in June define which capabilities each individual ally needs to provide to the alliance force posture in order to make sure we have a credible deterrence and defense. And these new capability targets are very demanding, much more demanding than the capability targets we had agreed in 2021. To start to implement these targets immediately, we need to invest in the necessary resources. And let me highlight 3 challenges we currently face in this respect. First, in terms of money, 3.5% of GDP is probably not too wide off the mark. Compared to other allies, I would consider ourselves in a rather comfortable position with regard to financing with the amendment of our constitutional law that exempts defense spending above 1% from the debt brake. I think we have a very good way to increase our defense spending according to our needs. Now, the second challenge is to overcome the massive challenge in terms of personnel, which comes with the capability target. You need more personnel. In only a few months, the German government intends to submit a draft legislation to Parliament for a new mode of conscription adopted to our military requirements and to our social realities. Let me be clear, this will not be the return of the old mandatory conscription for the time being, but many of you will be aware of the discussions we're having here in Germany on that topic. The third challenge, we need to ramp up our defense industrial capacities and become more effective in defense procurement. Among allies and partners, we need to strive to procure and develop together in a joint fashion. And here the European Union and its member states are currently doing groundwork in increasing European allies' contributions to NATO's deterrence and defense. And I'm referring here to the white paper of the EU white paper on European defense readiness and the SAFE initiative. Very important elements to it. And the reason why you see me not in uniform, but in my suit is that right after this meeting, I fly to Brussels, where we discuss EU capability planning, which is very closely linked nowadays to NATO's capability targets, something we wouldn't have thought of 3 years ago.
And thank you so much for now. Because we want to get into the question and answers, allow me to ask you a brief follow-up question, which will allow you to finish your point. Since you mentioned capabilities, in the beginning I mentioned a paper co-written by my colleagues that lay out some of those capabilities, including air defense, intelligence, and surveillance capabilities. Perhaps you could say a word on what exactly it is that needs to be done on the European and on the German level. So back to you, and then next will be Robert Aders afterwards.
Yeah, it is a fairly long list of topics, but you talked about the European Union level. There are a number of instruments the European Union has to foster joint procurement, to foster ramping up the defense industry. And these elements, for example, include that the possibilities for borrowing money to spend on defense capabilities are being discussed. And we're taking good steps forward there for nations which cannot borrow currently at favorable terms to get a good borrowing rates. It's also the discussion on exemption of defense spending from the Maastricht criteria which we're going for. So basically, the EU is working in particular on getting nations to spend more. We have a number of priorities and capability areas which are extremely important. That is air defense, that is deep precision strike, that is maneuver forces and overall readiness. We also have to look at cyber and space. These are sort of key components which we have to concentrate on in order to fulfill the capability targets in which we focus on first of all.
Thanks a lot. And let's move on to Dr. Robin Allers. You are based in Norway, so perhaps you could give us a bit of a perspective of the Nordics as well, but also an outlook beyond just the summit next week and the future of the alliance more broadly. Over to you.
Thank you, and good morning. Greetings from Oslo. Hope you can hear me. The DGAP strategy group's paper recommends strengthening or reconceptualizing the European pillar of NATO. And this involves preparing for moving from mere burden sharing also to burden shifting. So this is not a new debate, as you all know. Many will recall it from the late 1990s and onwards. But of course, today it involves an increasingly difficult dilemma for the alliance and for European allies. Because on the one hand, we have uncertainty about the United States' role linked to Trump's erratic behavior, as it has been called, recently shown as the G7 summit, and even doubts about the commitment to Article 5. But at the same time, allies know that they are totally dependent on the US and will remain so for quite some time. And that even if they want to become more independent, this will come at enormous cost, as some papers by IISS and also the DGAP paper has laid out. So what to do? I think, or I propose to think about this in 3 steps. In the short term, that means at the summit, allies need to appease, please, Trump, signal strongly that they are committed to take a bigger share of the burden. And this is, as I understand it, also something the US supports, wants the allies to do. And keep the Americans engaged, also with regard to Ukraine, hopefully, but mostly to deterrence. But the summit should also, and I think will be, used to achieve real progress with regard to capability targets, cooperation among allies in different formats with the EU, in smaller groupings, in the framework of NATO, together with the EU, and so on. But then comes the second step, and this is the longer term, and these are the next months until the next summit, of course. And in this term, the allies need to deliver, because the US will ask about progress, will need to see concrete signs. But it's also in the interest of the allies themselves to make substantial steps in becoming more autonomous, less dependent also on the US, while at the same time, of course, working on keeping the United States engaged. But in the long term, over the next years, I think the allies have no choice but to think about also the prospect of readjusted, adapted alliance, where the US might be not ready to be as engaged in the command structure as they are now and are prepared to do. So I think we also should start a progress, or allies should start a progress, where they are seriously thinking about their role, of the role of the alliance in the longer term and in the long term. What does this mean from the perspective of a country on the NATO's northern flank? There has been a Zeitenwende on the northern flank as well. Russia's aggressive behavior has brought Finland and Sweden to join NATO, Denmark to drop its opt-outs from the CSDP. And this opens possibilities for closer regional cooperation. but this also requires adaptation of national preferences. And it means also important to mention here that all the Nordics want to strengthen their cooperation, not only bilaterally or regionally, but also in the framework of Joint Force Command Norfolk US, which in the longer term then raises the question, is this sustainable? Are there alternatives to that as well? Not that the Nordics want this, but I think they also should start a debate on this. There's the challenge of a more militarized Arctic region, which is not new, but has also gained a new dimension with Trump's claims on Greenland. More worrisome is the fact that Russia's capabilities in the Arctic region are not as affected as one might think by the war in Ukraine. So the naval capabilities, the strategic submarines are there, are operating, and are not as affected as other parts of the Russian armed forces. And of course, there are the hybrid incidents and threats against critical infrastructure, both in the Baltic Sea and in the North Sea. Important to say also that the developments in Europe, not least the Zeitenwende in Germany, and the willingness to commit more to defense spending has raised great interest in the Nordic countries and will lead to more cooperation with European allies. I think in the short term, the Nordic allies will have no problem in playing a constructive role at the summit. Finland's President Stubb and Norway's Prime Minister Støre have already met Trump in the White House and demonstrated how they intend to play this. They also have committed already to the new spending targets and will make great efforts to achieve them. But in the longer term, this doesn't mean that this is an easy way to do for the Nordic countries as well, not even for Norway, which is among the richest countries in the world and should do this and can do this without taking greater debt as opposed to other countries. But also here, the discussions will come about balancing defense spending against other duties, social questions, and so on. So
if I could ask you to
yes,
finish the sentence.
Yeah, but just the longer point, I think one of the most difficult questions then for the Nordic countries will be to rethink also the prospect of readjusting the alliance, because the sense of being totally dependent on the US and also being deeply integrated with the US is very, very strong. So Nordic countries, I think, will be a strong advocate for keeping the US as engaged as possible on every level.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much. We'll come back to you in a moment. Since I know that both General Schulz and also Aylin Matlé have to leave somewhat ahead of 9:30, we have to squeeze in as many questions and comments as possible now. And I see a first question in the chat by Michael Nienaber already from Bloomberg News asking to Stefan Schulz a question on the US military review, which is expected after the NATO summit, and asking about some nervousness in Europe about the Pentagon potentially announcing a sharp reduction in US troops in Europe once the summit has come to an end. And so to what extent, he's asking, do you share these concerns? And do you expect a reduction in US troop levels? So that's a question for General Schulz. And I would like to pick up another question by Klaus Wittmann, who's raised his hand.
In my Klaus Wittmann, I'm teaching at Potsdam University, former officer of the Bundeswehr. In my many years in NATO, I would never have thought that the main goal of a NATO summit could be to please the US president. But so be it, and I'm encouraged by some of the more hopeful speculations that the first speaker made. I have a question to General Schulz. You mentioned three challenges with regard to the implementation of the capability targets. Is not a fourth one infrastructure, civil protection, preparations, and regulations that we used to have during the Cold War? And I would encourage you to say perhaps a few words about the OPLAN Germany. which I think is also one aspect of the growing credibility of our defense effort.
Thank you so much. So we've got Operation Plan Germany, infrastructure, Cold War measures, and also the question I read previously about potential US troop reductions in Europe. General Schulz, can I ask you to take these two questions up first, and then we'll move on after that.
Right, thank you very much for these questions. Let me start with the first question on the US force posture. Traditionally, the United States, when a new administration comes in, conducts a number of reviews. One of them is a force posture review where they readjust the force posture. And we expect that to come sometime in summer or late summer, certainly after the summit. And we don't know how in the end the force posture will look like. We are fairly confident with respect to Germany that we provide very good host nation support, very important structures, and the forces stationed in Germany are not only there to collect defense, but they are a hub worldwide with Ramstein, for example, for US interests. So we are fairly confident that we provide very good conditions for US forces. However, we have to be prepared that the pivot to Asia, as it is always called, might play a role, and it would have done so with any US administration. If you go to the Indo-Pacific, you see the enormous challenge the United States have in this region. So yes, you need to see, but this, I would say, is factored in already in our capability targets. And that is why it is very important that us Europeans and Canadians ramp up their capabilities, and that in NATO we have a process. If there is reductions from the United States, that this is done in an orderly fashion, because there are some capabilities, deep precision strike, but Europeans need some time to catch up, that this process of US reduction is matched with the uplift of European capabilities. The second question on the op plan or infrastructure regulations, yes, there are a lot of activities there. You will have heard that the Bundeswehr has sort of stopped handing over infrastructure. We're looking very closely at our infrastructure. We need more infrastructure, ammunition depots, but also barracks. So we're looking into getting the infrastructure back to the shape we had before, or in a similar way. We are looking very closely at regulations nationally, but also on the European side. The European Union develops a defense omnibus. We contributed what we want to change. So that looks at all the hurdles you have in, for example, extending defense industry. That goes to infrastructure. It goes to exceptions you might need for defense on the environmental laws. It has to do with contracting. So a lot of small but important elements in law and practices are looked at in order to get quicker in procurement and in setting up our forces. Op plan Germany, it is the plan we have in Germany on it's a government-wide responsibility we have in Germany as a country through which reinforcements need to be quickly moved from west to east if needed. And Op plan Germany is one of the plans we have to make that happen. And as I say, it's a whole of government activity, but we're moving fast, I would say. And we have some elements we can build on from Cold War, but many things we have to revitalize. So big responsibility, but I think we're on a good way there.
Thanks. Mario Baumann.
Thank you very much. Mario Baumann from DGAP. Thanks to all the speakers. I have two short questions, and my first one goes to General Schulz. Ukraine and the trajectory of the war in Ukraine is one of the major factors for European security, but yet, in contrary to financial and military capability targets, it's probably one of the most controversial issues in The Hague. I was wondering if you could share a couple of thoughts on Germany's approach to how to handle Ukraine in The Hague. What role will Ukraine play, and can we expect a strong signal support. And I have a second short question to Robin. Germany formulated ambitious plans in the course of its Zeitenwende with regard to its military. I was just wondering if you could maybe outline the perception of Germany in Norway, the Nordic countries, and maybe also the expectations the Nordic countries have towards Germany in NATO.
Thanks a lot for these questions, and allow me to chip in a question of my own to Aylin, because I know that you have to head to the next meeting soon. Aylin, you talked a little bit about the time since the last summit. Now, as General Schulz, I think, pointed out, and some others as well, the fact that Mark Rutte has allowed the allies to come together with this level of preparation, with an eye on the 5% target in this manner, etc. Would you consider the preparation a success already? And is perhaps the preparatory process much more important than the summit in itself? I'm asking this question knowing that I think you will be traveling to The Hague, so I'm suspecting that you might have something to say on what is going on at the summit itself, including the public forum that I think you'll be a part of. So perhaps let's start with Aylin, and then moving in reverse order, going to Robin next, and then to General Schulz.
Well, obviously, I will only be watching from the margins and not be part of the actual summit, but it might hopefully give me some insights into what is happening at the summit itself. Surely, and that General Schulz has already alluded to that earlier, the preparations are still ongoing, and that is very usual in terms of preparing for any big political event. So it's not very unique to NATO, but I think with regard to the president that is residing in the White House now, it is all the more important to come really prepared to a summit, and in order to avoid or to sort of to leave as little room for surprises as possible. Obviously, that doesn't mean that these surprises can still come at the summit itself, as we just saw at the G7 summit, or had to witness at the G7 summit. But I'm relatively confident, especially with regard to the relatively good relationship between Mark Rutte and President Trump, that the preparation work really has played in NATO's favor. And if I just may add one quick remark on the US troop presence in Germany, which already General Schulz has answered, I just wanted to add sort of two footnotes. First, apparently in the meeting between Trump and Merz in the White House, Trump has assured Chancellor Merz that US troops would remain on German soil. Obviously, that's still no guarantee, but it still, I think it could have come much worse in light of what many observers expected coming from coming from that meeting, but also the US second Trump presidency in general. And at the same time, we also know that directives coming from Pete Hegseth, the defense minister, that have been leaked indicate that this so-called Taiwan scenario is supposed to dictate the agenda of the Pentagon in terms of force posture, defense, and operational planning. So again, I'm pretty sure that we will see some sort of withdrawal, a level of withdrawal. But then again, let's not forget, Trump is not the first president to do that, not only with regard to the posture review, but also, that process with the so-called pivot to Asia began with Barack Obama more than 10 years ago. It was Obama who decided to withdraw two heavy armored brigades from Germany. So just to sort of contextualize it, yes, the situation with Trump now is certainly different as opposed to what we saw under Barack Obama, but still we can see some sort of continuation in that regard.
Thanks for this context, Aylin. Over to Robin Allers.
Thanks for the question, Mario. 3 points. First, I think we sometimes underestimate how strong the signal of the first Zeitenwende in 2022 was. It was very positively perceived, but of course something allies have watched closely, to what extent it was follow up, and there has been this uncertainty about this, how substantial it was, how backed up it was, and I think in this perspective, this Zeitenwende 2.0, or the new government is supposedly a new strong signal, but it's been generally positively perceived, and on the Nordic flank, the countries want more German engagement. Second, when we talk about German engagement, we talk about two things. Norway in particular wants allies to be present and prepared on the northern flank. And this always raises the question, is Germany ready to do this in the same way the UK, the US, and even France is doing this operationally? At the time, Germany is mostly present through as a strong partner in capabilities, and is the strongest partner next to the US, but there's a potential to becoming more engaged. At the same time, Nordic countries also understand that Germany is at the heart of Europe and has to watch into different, in many directions. But still, Germany is wanted on the northern flank. Third point, there are certain areas where the Nordics cannot lead, for example, on nuclear deterrence and so on, but also on preparing the alliance or the strengthening the European pillar of the alliance. I think here countries on the different flanks are looking to the big players, including Germany, for more leadership. I think there's a difficult word in Germany, but these are the big countries who need to take the alliance and the European pillar forward. And I think this is something where the Nordic countries then want to plug in, and Germany is a preferred partner to most of them. Thanks.
Thanks so much. Before I hand over to you, Stefan Schulz, I don't know if you saw the comment in the chat, so let me just read out the questions for those who might not have seen it. It's also a question directed to you from Chris Lundy from Politico Europe, asking, from the German perspective, what specific amendments or strategic priorities do you believe should be reflected in the upcoming defense omnibus? And could you elaborate on these areas where Germany sees a need for adjustment or stronger alignment within the alliance framework, and how has this been received by other EU countries? So I don't know if you saw the question, perhaps you could pick it up as well. Over to you, General Schulz.
Yeah, thank you very much. Got two questions, but I would like to quickly react to a previous speaker on Norway's expectations. I would say we are already working very closely with Norway. We have the Norwegian, Canadian, German security partnership on maritime issues where we work together very closely. We focus as Germany normally on the regional plan east or center, we call it. However, we have army contingents, for example, aligned to regional plan northeast. So we do also contribute there. And with Norway, for example, we have a very close armed cooperation in maritime issues, for example, with the submarines. So we recognize this. We recognize the importance of the Northern Atlantic, of the Arctic region. We continue our exercises there together with other nations. And we also want to give the impression that this is an area where Germany will be engaged despite having the main focus further east. Now, on the question Ukraine, you know the general position of Germany concerning Ukraine. We want to continue strengthening Ukraine. We want to continue delivering and training, which we do at a very high level. You know that we plan to spend 7 billion euros this year on helping Ukraine. We continue training up to 10,000 Ukrainians in Germany. How about the summit? Will there be a signal? I think what will at least happen is that we will underline the continued support to Ukraine. You know, NATO does quite a lot with Ukraine funds, with NATO, and there is no indications that the United States have decreased their commitment there. To the contrary, they are completely continuing there. Now, there might be a NATO-Ukraine Council on the level of foreign ministers. NATO Secretary General Rutte intends to invite President Zelensky. How will it in the end factor out? We will see. I have taken part in a number of summit negotiations, and the exact wording will always be worked on to the last moment. And you know that Ukraine is not an easy topic when it comes to nailing down the words which we want to precisely have in the summit declaration. And the last question, let me recap the defense omnibus. What is in it? It's, if you look at it, Germany provided suggestions on changes, and they were not only from the Ministry of Defense, they were government-wide ideas where you can change things. And we provided many ideas. It had many pages what we put in. And some of them are very technical. They, for example, talk about rules on chemical substances in products, which limit the possibility to quickly produce ammunition. They talk about environmental rules and regulations to build up new factories. It involves the law of procurement, which we have in the EU. So there are a plethora of things which need to be changed in the rules and regulations, which are plentiful in the EU. And we expect that the European Union, or they just have put out this defense omnibus with all these different suggestions where you could make life easier for the armed forces, for the industry. And now it has to go into legislation to change those things where we think there can be exceptions and changes in order to let industry and armed forces work quicker.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I don't currently see any more hands up. There's one quick follow-up question, I think, on US support to Ukraine and particularly US support to Ukraine post-Biden. So perhaps in the next round, you could pick up this question. But since I don't see any other questions, oh, yes, I do. Klaus Wittmann, please.
Once more, very briefly, ask a question that I put to the speakers 2 weeks ago already at the morning briefing. If General Schulz talks about an orderly fashion to rearrange defense burdens in Europe, I have always thought that a very constructive way would be to commission at the summit the development of some kind of roadmap. There were authors who said we should commission a new strategic concept there. This is much too early, I think. But I also think of, for instance, the comprehensive political guidance at Riga 2006, when there was no agreement to start the new strategic concept process. And in my NATO years, I've made the experience that often the path towards the new document is almost as important as the document itself. And I could see a process where the two sides of the two sides of the Atlantic, one agrees that one would together develop what you called an orderly fashion, where the European capabilities rise and the American commitment is gradually reduced, and that would result not only in burden sharing but in a new distribution of responsibilities. What do you think?
Thank you so much. Let me, in addition to Klaus Wittmann's comment and question, by way of closing this discussion today, ask everyone to briefly summarize the situation, not just the best case for this upcoming summit, but a best case for where we might be in 1 year. So as a way of closing remarks, perhaps you would like to pick up any questions left out there. Since I know that 2 of our speakers have to leave sharply, perhaps we could start in the same order as we began. Aylin Matlé, Stefan Schulz, and then Robin Ahlers. Over to you, Aylin.
I think the best case scenario that we could hope for, looking a year ahead into the future, is what has already been touched upon a couple of times now, and that is the sort of organizing a orderly and constructive not burden sharing, but burden shifting process, which in all likelihood will happen, whether we like it, we as Europeans like it or not. And I think, again, I'm trying to be a sort of a glass half full person based on the indicators that I presented earlier, which are just a few. You could also name some others. But based on that assessment, I think we could actually convince the Americans that it is also in their interest, in their national and security interest, to not withdraw chaotically from the European theater, and also that it is in their interest to remain somewhat committed. And we already know that, and I forgot to mention that earlier, but I think General Schulz alluded to that, the US seems to still be committed to its nuclear deterrence mission vis-a-vis NATO and vis-a-vis Europe. So I think we will, again, in a best case scenario, we'll end up in a place where nuclear sharing will be continued by nuclear extended deterrence will be continued by the US, and some level of US troops will also remain in not only in Germany, but Europe as a whole. And if we could really sort of organize it in a orderly fashion, I think we'd be looking at a win-win situation.
Thanks, Aylin. General Schulz, over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Shall I quickly answer the question on the roadmap or the orderly fashion? There are quite some discussions in NATO on that question. How do we best do it? How do we do it in a way which suits both sides? And those of you who are a bit more familiar with the NATO defense planning process know that the process is geared to do exactly that. Capability development takes time. It does not happen overnight. And this process of saying who is doing what, who is providing these capabilities, is aligned with the United States. And here in this process, which is an iterative process, it had circuits, we can use that process to assure that the capability developments, the sharing, maybe the shifting of capabilities will be done in a coordinated way. What do we expect in 1 year? What would be good? I would say in 1 year, it would be perfect if we have kept our unity in NATO, but not only there, but also in the European Union. It's equally important that we keep our unity there vis-a-vis Russia's aggression. Second point, all European nations, allies can show in practical terms that they're improving their capabilities so that the United States can see that we are pulling our weight. And the third one, already said, clarity on the US position, US underlining their commitment to NATO, in particular with respect to extended nuclear deterrence. Thank you.
Thank you, Robin Alles.
I can subscribe to everything the previous speakers have said. I also think the best case scenario would be a situation where we keep the US engaged in Europe in the best possible way, especially on the big questions like nuclear deterrence, of course, and at the same time start an orderly process by strengthening the European pillar, going from burden sharing to burden shifting. I would caution, however, that I don't think we have much time, and I think this summit should be a shift of gears with regard to European cooperation, because I think we need to be prepared for a situation where a conflict escalates, where there's a change of mind in the White House for whatever reason, where Europe suddenly comes in a situation where they need to take much more responsibility that they are prepared for. So I think this really needs to be stepped up, and orderly fashion should not mean complacency.
If you are interested in more events on transatlantic relations, DGAP is hosting a few of them. For our members, we are hosting John Bolton tonight for an event. There is a web talk by my colleague from Internationale Politik, the magazine, with the journalist Kerstin Kohlenberg on Monday. And on the 26th of June, we are hosting, together with the broadcaster RBB, an event here with Henning Hotte, Dietmar Bartsch, Henrik Braus, and Sabine Fischer. So do subscribe to these events. Do stay tuned also for next morning briefing. We'll talk about Iran and Russia, amongst other things, next week on this morning briefing. But let me thank, above all, our speakers again. for your contributions today, and have a lovely day, everyone. Bye-bye.